Most graphic designers would agree that fonts are an important part of the aesthetic of a website. But fonts haven't always been easy to get into a website. And so in this lecture, what I would like to do is talk about ways to get fonts into a website and the history of how we've gotten to this point. My name is Professor J Patterson, and this is Fonts on the Web. Key points I'd like to communicate in this lecture are that fonts on the web used to be very hard, and that really Google has set the standard and has blazed the way forward for how to provide legal and widely available fonts for web pages. I also want to demonstrate that fonts consume bandwidth, and so are a resource you have to be careful of when creating a website. Fonts are actually really legally complicated. It's a bit of a pain to work with them. In many ways, they're kind of like images. If you were going to responsibly put an image onto your website, you need to make sure that you have copyright permission in order to use that image. So typically what that would mean would be that you would need to get permission from the holder of the copyright for that image in order to use it. Maybe from the photographer, or maybe from some kind of agency that distributes rights for those photographs. And sometimes obtaining the rights for that photograph entails paying for those rights. And they can either go, sometimes that money goes to the photographer or to the agency that represents the work. In the same way, fonts are treated a lot like that as well. One of the ways in which fonts are protected is through something called a design patent. And in fact, the very first US design patent was issued for a typeface in 1842. It was a typeface called Double Pica, and actually the design patent was for 4 different typefaces at the same time. Modern design patents are used in order to cover the configuration or shape of an article, the surface ornamentation applied to an article, or the combination of configuration and surface ornamentation. And they last for 14 years. So roughly, this is something about the way in which a material object or a presentation of a design is delivered to a customer or to an observer. 14 years is not a very long time to protect this, and it's considered a balance between the aesthetic that's presented and the use of the work more broadly. There are 3 kinds of ways in which intellectual property are used in the computer space. We talk about trademarks, patents, and copyright, and all of them are relevant in some ways to fonts. So let me describe these in turn, and then we can come back to our discussion of fonts and the legal environment around them. So for starters, there's the trademark. A trademark is a word or a phrase or a design or a combination of those things that identifies your goods or services, that distinguishes them from the goods and services of others, and that indicates the source of your goods and services. And an example of this would be the trademark Coca-Cola. You can see little R with a circle around it means it is a registered trademark. By registering your trademark with the U.S. Patent and Trade Office, as a particularly U.S.-focused lecture, it's going to help prevent others from using your trademark or your brand name in a way that's similar for the same kinds of goods or services, so that there's no confusion about what a consumer is getting. The second kind of intellectual property is a patent. And a patent covers and protects a technical innovation, maybe something like a chemical composition of a pharmaceutical drug, or a mechanical process for complex machinery, or some kind of design for a machine that's new or unique or usable in some particular kind of industry. So an example of something that might be covered by a patent would be a new kind of hybrid engine for an electric car, for example. When you register a patent, that safeguards your invention or your processes from other parties copying or duplicating, making or using or selling that same invention without your consent, and typically without licensing it from the inventor. The third way in which intellectual property is protected is through something called a copyright. A copyright covers artistic, music, literary, some sort of intellectually created work, novels, movies, music, software code, photographs, paintings that are original and that exist in a tangible medium, such as paper, canvas, film, or a digital format. So an example of this would be the lyrics to Let It Go from the movie Frozen. What copyright does is it protects your exclusive right as a creator to reproduce, distribute, and or perform or display the created work, and it prevents other people from monetizing that creative work that you've done, copying or exploiting it in any way without your explicit permission. So these three kinds of intellectual property are used in tandem in order to protect a company and protect the goods. So let me give this in an example of a company that I worked with. A startup company that ended up folding, but that had all three of them. So the company was called Cube, Q-U-U-B, and we had several different kinds of protection. So we used the trademark, for example, to protect our brand. And so what the trademark did is it protected our little mascot here, which was a robot called Cubie, the look and presentation of that robot. It protected our name, Cube, from being used in a similar kind of market, in a similar kind of way, a digital software platform. It also protected our logo, which represented the way in which we presented our product to the world. That was what the trademark protected. Now, what our patent protected was the way in which we did our predictive messaging service. And so this was about a protection for the algorithm, the algorithm and the process by which we did our artificial intelligence messaging. And the third thing that we had was copyright. And what copyright did is it protected the software code that we used to implement our algorithm. So three different ways in which intellectual property is used that protect a business or some work in three different kinds of ways. And all of them are important they're important in different ways. And depending on what role you play in the ecosystem, one or the other might be more important to you. Or maybe all three would be, like it was in our startup. So fonts are legally complicated. One of the reasons why is because typefaces can't be copyrighted. Now, earlier I said that the first design patent was for a typeface called Double Pica. But a typeface can't be copyrighted. What that means is that the design of the letter shapes, that's not considered important enough to protect when you consider the countervailing value of allowing people to use that particular typeface. Copyright would be great if you could get it, because copyright protects creative works for the life of the creator plus 70 years. And so that means that copyright is quite valuable if you can assert it. So we can see that typefaces can't be copyrighted by looking at US federal regulations. And we can drill down into a particular title and chapter, and we can look at material subject to copyright. And in particular, typefaces as typefaces are called out as one of the materials that are not subject to copyright. Oh, okay, so that would seem like fonts should be really easy to use. They can't be copyrighted, so if you can get your hands on one, that's great. Well, it turns out that the legal complications didn't stop there. Digital fonts, in contrast to just typefaces, can be copyrighted. And the reason why they can be copyrighted is because some of these digital fonts, most of them, are defined by software, not just by an image. Software is considered creative work and is able to be copyrighted, protected by copyright. And so formats like PostScript Type 1, TrueType, OpenType, these are all software formats for fonts that include algorithmic instructions within them. For example, controlling control points of the fonts, describing Bezier curves, and how all the font letters get rendered at different sizes and in different ways. Because there's software behind the drawing of these fonts, digital fonts in these formats can be copyrighted. However, a font which is just a bitmap cannot be copyrighted. So it has to be in one of these fonts that has software underneath it. Now, it may not surprise you to learn that this right to copyright a digital font was a legal right that was pursued and sort of first developed by Adobe. And Adobe Software Systems did this in a lawsuit against a company called Southern Software. One of the people in Southern Software had attempted to take one of Adobe's fonts described through one of these software systems and had done very small changes to the control points in the Bezier curve. So while technically it was different, the presentation of the resulting font looked exactly the same. Adobe sued and ended up winning, establishing a legal precedent that digital fonts can be copyrighted, and instituted quite a lucrative business for Adobe for many years. This was in 1995, and the font in question was Adobe's Utopia font. That was the one that was the subject of the relevant litigation. And for those of you who are font geeks out there, true confession, I'm a little bit of a font geek. I like going into the details of fonts. This is an example of the Utopia font, the one that was the subject of the lawsuit. This created a kind of legal mess then for the internet. It was difficult now in order to present fonts on web pages. And so in 1996, kind of after the font, in the middle of several of these lawsuits playing out, Microsoft saw the problem for their budding business with Internet Explorer and introduced a project called Core Fonts. And what Core Fonts was a selection of several fonts listed here: Andali Mono, Arial Black, our favorite, Comic Sans, MS, Courier New, Georgia Impact, Times New Roman, Trebuchet MS, Verdana, and then the Proto Emoji Webdings font. They introduced these as core fonts. And what that meant was that every Microsoft computer was going to come with Windows operating system would come all of these fonts. So any web designer that wanted to use one of these fonts would be sure that if the page was being displayed on Internet Explorer, these fonts would be available. And they would be available for free because Microsoft created them and offered them without any licensing restrictions. This was a good way for Microsoft to make progress in Internet Explorer, but it left graphic designers at a bit of a loss because this was the sole range of fonts that they could use for free without having to pay a licensing fee to Adobe. However, you could pretty much be assured that all these fonts were going to be available for a user who is looking at a website on the internet, at least if they were using a Microsoft computer, which at this time was dominating the browser market and whatnot. So shortly after that, the Fontface property was introduced in CSS2, about 1988. So hooray, huzzah! What this means is that now other software fonts, in addition to Microsoft Web Fonts, could be used from web pages. So using the Fontface property, you could specify one of Microsoft's core fonts, which you could be confident was there, or you could specify another font, which had to be on the user's computer. So although we had Fontface, many of the users didn't have any other fonts that were available on their computer. And when they did, they would render differently on different platforms. So you might specify one font that wasn't present in Microsoft's core fonts, and although two different computers might have that font, it wouldn't render the same on both computers. This is the kind of detail that drives graphic designers nuts, and it prevents your website from communicating the sort of aesthetic and brand that's very important to modern companies, especially ones that rely on visual presentation. So in order to accommodate this problem of users not having some fonts available on their computer, the font stack principle was introduced in CSS. Font stacks, which you may see in other sorts of training venues, like for example, if you take a CSS course on Code Academy, you'll run across font stacks. What this allowed designers to do was to specify a sequence of fonts that they wanted text to be rendered in on a web page, but to have fallback or backup fonts in case the primary font wasn't available. For example, if they weren't available on a user's computer. So what that might look like is something like this. This is a selection of a CSS cascading style sheet file in which 3 different selectors and 3 different presentations are described. They each are presented as styling for paragraph tags. The first one refers to paragraph tags that have the class choice 1 selected in the attribute, and then the second for choice 2 and the third for choice 3. If we look at choice 1, what we see is a font stack where the first preferred font that this paragraph would be rendered in would be the Segway UI font. But if that font isn't available, then the browser is instructed to use the backup font Segway. And if that font's not available, to use the backup font Tahoma, and if that's not available, to use the backup font Geneva, and if that's not available, to use any sans serif font that's available on the computer, which means any font that doesn't have serifs, which are the little tails that are like on the bottom of the T or on the sides of the top of the T. In contrast, paragraphs with the choice 2 class the designer preferred to have them rendered in the Georgia font. And if that wasn't available on the computer, then the Cambria font. And if that wasn't available, then the Times New Roman. And if that wasn't available, Times. And if that wasn't available, any serif font that was available. Finally, in the Choice 3 class, the designer preferred Arial to be the primary font. And if that wasn't available, then Helvetica. And if that wasn't available, then any sans serif font that was available on the computer. Now, since all computers come with something that's in the class of serif or sans serif, the designer is sure that the backup is going to be met in some capacity, but perhaps not in the font that they preferred. So the font stack, therefore, was a response to the licensing requirements that were introduced by Adobe and the core fonts that were introduced by Microsoft, but the graphic designer's desire to be able to expand to a wider range of fonts than what was available in the Microsoft core fonts. Well, this continued to fail as mobile browsing began to take over the space, or at least began to be equally important with the space of web browsing. And the problem was that mobile browsers supported a completely different set of fonts. There were fonts like the Android fonts, Droid Sans and Droid Serif, and eventually Roboto. The iOS fonts, which is relatively recent, of San Francisco. These are the native fonts of Android and iOS respectively. And now designers didn't even have access to the Microsoft core fonts. And designers now had very little confidence in their design being rendered the way in which it was intended to be rendered. So our Panda designers were sad. What to be done about this situation? For a long time, it was actually kind of ugly. Websites were pretty ugly and designers couldn't have confident reproduction. This was the era of Flash, for example, when Flash was a completely alternative way of doing web pages, and Flash had a lot of support for specific fonts being built into it. In a normal website, though, in a normal HTML font, the solution was something called embedded fonts. And what embedded fonts were a way to, within the HTML, provide instructions to the browser on where to go and get fonts that weren't available on the user's local computer. So if the designer had some font that they wanted to have used, you could put a link to where on the internet they could find them. The browser would, just like loading a remote image, could download that font and then render the website with that font. Google Fonts was one of the first organizations to use this. And their fonts were completely free and are completely free and unencumbered, and use this technique. This put quite a damper on Adobe's business. So Adobe had a paid font business. They still do, where you have to license fonts. Typically, this is done for things like signage or publications, where there's a particular font that you want to have access to and you need to pay to have access to it. But on the web, Google Fonts, by providing fonts for free, was decimating Adobe's business for web fonts. So just recently, like in the last few years, I'm not exactly sure when the transition happened, Adobe started giving away many of their fonts nearly for free, in the same way that Google Fonts are given away for free. If you as a designer have a subscription to Creative Cloud, then you also can get Adobe fonts in the same way that you get access to Google Fonts. Of course, Google Fonts, you don't even need a subscription to anything. Most sources, however, are mixed. So many cases you can get a font that is free for personal use, but the designer of the font asks you to pay for a commercial font. So these are kind of specialized fonts. So if you don't go to Google Fonts or Adobe Fonts to get your fonts, you might go to something like defont.com or fontlibrary.org, which is where individual designers offer their fonts for sale or for use in different ways. You just have to be careful when you're using a font that you understand the licensing arrangement around them, especially if you're doing something other than Google Fonts. So Google Fonts changed the landscape of the web design field by offering these fonts for free and without licensing requirements. And it still remains the dominant way in which fonts are delivered across web pages now. As of last time I checked, there are many fonts that are available on their website, over 1,050 right now, and there's a lot of support for getting them. They're free to use, and Google provides servers which offer them on behalf of the websites that need them. Here's an example of 8 of them. These are all display fonts, which is a particular category of fonts that's used for headlines or for callouts, not really for long spans of text, but for short bits that you want to call out in various ways. You can see there are a bunch of different font names. They're a little bit different font names than maybe you've seen in other places. Original Surfer, Bangers, Babas Nui, Lobster along the bottom there. And the way you interact with this site is a little bit like a shopping site. Although you're not buying the fonts, you pick the fonts you want, you put them into a shopping cart, and then when you're ready to use them, Google will create some HTML code that you can include in your website that then enables you to have access to those fonts in your design. Adding a Google font requires linking to an external style sheet, in the same way that you might link to your own external style sheet, which contains the styling for your website. In this case, though, the styles are hosted by Google. So the basic 3 steps that you go through in order to use a font is, first, you find a font you like. And that means going to the Google website and browsing and finding a font that meets your needs. Second, once you've done that, you get the HTML code from Google's website, you copy it, and you paste it into your HTML code. The third thing that you do is you reference that font in the font family property of your CSS rules, so that then when your web page is rendered, you use the font that has been loaded from Google. So let's see a little bit of an example of this. We can select, for example, the Original Surfer font here. And there are a lot of nice things that come along with this interface on Google's website. For example, you get the code that you need. So if all I wanted was one particular font, this is what Google provides for me. At the top, you see the code that's recommended to put into your head of your HTML document. The first tag is a link tag. And what that's telling your web browser to do is to get ready to go out to fonts.gstatic.com to pull down some files. So it's like a warm-up warning. It's telling your browser that something's coming next. The next line is the actual link to the file, or link to the description of the fonts that your browser is then going to go out and request. That goes in your HTML. Then in your CSS rules, you put the code at the bottom, the font family, and you say, well, if what you want is this font, then the way you specify it is with Original Surfer. And you'll notice that the font stack is being used here. Because if Original Surfer isn't available, then Google recommends you fall back on the built-in font which meets the category of cursive, which will come with the browser, because all browsers will come with at least something in the cursive category. Well, if we're downloading a font from Google, then why do we need a backup font? Well, it's always a good idea to have at least one backup font that's in the category that exists on your computer, in case, for example, you have a network glitch, or it takes a while to get the font from Google. Because while your browser is downloading that font from Google, it can display the text in an alternate font. And then once the font is down, it will rewrite the text, albeit with a little bit of a visual glitch, in the style that the designer intended. All right, so lots of details. One of the things that I like a lot, because I'm sort of not, I appreciate graphic design, but I'm not really that great at it, is that you get a lot of information about the font. And in particular, I like the fact that you can get pairings of your font. So when you select Original Surfer, you'll go into a page about the font with all the details of what characters are supported, who designed it, and what exactly the license is. And you can go down to the bottom and you can see a bunch of fonts that are recommended for pairing with that font. So here we see an example of the Pacifico font being used for the phrase, "The spectacle before us was indeed sublime." And then the Original Surfer font is being used down below it. And so this is a suggestion of a couple fonts you might like to put together to make a reasonable graphic design. Looks good to me. So let's go through an example. What is it like to go through these 3 steps? Selecting the font you want, choosing your variants, and then grabbing the HTML. Actually, those are slightly different. We'll just go through an example pulling Google fonts in. These are the first 2 of those 3 steps. All right, so here's a font that I like, Special Elite. I went to the Google font page and I clicked on it. It's kind of got a distressed typewriter kind of look. The font there is in the phrase "almost before we knew." You can see that I clicked on Add this style. Right now it says Remove this style. But when I hit Add that style, you can see that on the right column, a little kind of shopping cart shows up that shows all of the fonts that are currently in my CSS rule. So right now it's just Special Elite. You can see what weights of my font and what treatments of my font are included. So right now I only have the regular font and I have it at 400 weight. This particular font doesn't have a lot of options, and so I think that's the only option for this particular font. But I'm not done. I would like to have a font pairing with this. So in addition to Special Elite, what I'm going to do is pair it with Meriwether. Meriwether's another font, and you can see in this case there are a lot more treatments to this font. You can see that there's a light treatment, there's a light italic treatment, there's a regular treatment, and it goes on down. And what I decided to do was to just add that light 300 treatment. So 300 refers to how bold it is, lower numbers being lighter, and then regular or italic meaning whether it's angled or not. Now in my shopping cart, you can see that I've got Special Elite and Meriwether present, just a few of the treatments. And if you notice that there's been a change in the code so that both of those fonts are now reflected in the code. So what I do now is I take that particular code. I don't need to hit the download all button. If I click the download all button, what that's going to do is load these fonts as files onto my computer so that I can deliver them from my website if I want, but I don't actually need to have them on my website if I'm comfortable having Google provide them to me. And if all I want is for Google to provide them to me, then the code in the gray boxes here is what I need to grab. So that's what I'm going to do for the remainder of this example, is use the files hosted on Google's website. So now I have a simple website. Here's my simple website. It's got the HTML5 boilerplate. It's got a head section and a body section. You can see that in the head section, I have a title for this page. It says font sample. That'll end up in the browser tab. And I've added the 2 link tags that were provided for me by Google when I selected my fonts. The first one warms up my browser with a connection to Google's hosting server. The second one is a URL that's specifically constructed to grab the fonts and the weights that I asked for. Now, if you want, you can manually construct this if you know how to do it. Of course, it's got some specific syntax and it's a little hairy, so it's not clear that the best thing to do would be to try and do that yourself. But if you look at it, it's not crazy hard. You can see that the font family Meriwether at weight 300 is there, and the font family Special Elite is there. So we have 2 link tags that are added to the head of my document. Now I have an internal style sheet as well. Internal style sheets aren't our best practice. We prefer to have external style sheets, but just for the point of teaching, I'm putting this here so you can see how it all works together. In my internal style sheet, I've specified 2 classes that I would like to provide treatments for. The lead class, LEDE, and the copy class. And in the lead class, I would like anything that has this class as an attribute to use the font family Special Elite. And you can see I'm using the font stack so that if my connection to Google is broken or it takes a long time to get that font, in the meantime, a cursive font will be used to display things that are annotated with the lead annotation. I'm also going to make it 300 times as large. It's a headline. It's going to be a headline. In my second class, the copy class, I'm going to use the font family Meriwether, and the backup will be serif as well. So for a font stack with an embedded font like this, you really only need 2 things in your font stack. In the body of my web page, I've got 2 paragraph tags. The first one uses the lead class, and notice that when I specify lead here as the attribute in my paragraph tag, I don't put the dot. The dot is just an indicator in the style portion that what I'm referring to is a class. But when I actually use it as a class, I don't use the dot in front of the lead. I say a grocery store obsession as my first text, and then in the copy, I have the text there that starts with "at first you might." So when I go to render this, I get a pretty nice, I think, I'm no graphic designer, but I think a pretty nice treatment of this document. You see that a grocery store garlic obsession is in the lead class, lead treatment, using the Special Elite font, and then the paragraph is in the Meriwether font. It's pretty good, I think. But as you get excited about fonts, you have to remember that it does take time to download these fonts. And so you don't want to overdo it with fonts. As you are probably familiar with the Chrome and developer tools, you can open up using the inspect selector. If you right click on a web page, you can go down and you can click inspect, and then you can click on the network tab. And if you click on disable cache and then you reload this web page, you'll see how long it takes to get these different resources. Now in this particular case, I specified that I wanted to pretend like it was over a 3G connection. And so that caused everything to slow down quite a bit just so that we could see how much bandwidth these connections require. The HTML itself took 2 seconds. You can see the initial request for CSS looks like about 3 seconds. The second bar and the third bar and the fourth bar are the actual fonts that are being downloaded. And you can see that the fonts themselves took twice or about twice as long as the original HTML document itself. So it's like a non-trivial amount of time if you're very concerned about latency on your website. You want to be cautious that you're only downloading fonts that you're going to use. So here are some optimizations if you want to make sure that your website is as fast and as low latency as possible. So the first one is straightforward. Only download the fonts that you need. It's pretty easy to find yourself just copying and pasting link tags from other HTML documents that you had so that you get the fonts that you used previously. And it's pretty easy to just like throw in everything in the kitchen sink for the fonts. But it may be the case that you're downloading a lot more font files than you really need. So only download the fonts that you need for a particular website. Secondly, only download the variants that you need as well. So maybe you don't need bold for a particular font. Don't download it. That'll reduce the number of character renderings that you need to download. And if you want to be particularly optimizing in your website, then you may only want to download specific characters. And so there's a special hack that you can do in the URL to bring this out. And that's to add this text key value pair to your URL that specifies your fonts. And so what I've done here is I've said, actually, although I want the Meriwether font, I only want the characters that are present in a grocery store, respecting the capitalizations, where the %20 are spaces. So I only want a grocery store to be the characters that are downloaded. And if I do this, then I'm only going to get those characters in the font that I requested. So that's what it would look like if I rendered it with this particular tag in the link tag. And you can see that a grocery store is rendered the way I expected it to be, but garlic isn't. All the characters in garlic that are also in a grocery store rendered appropriately. But the characters that weren't, like the A and the L and the I, were rendered in the backup font, the font stack, which in this case was cursive, if I recall correctly. So that's kind of a little niche super font nerd trick that you might want to use sometime in the future if you need a particularly fast website on a mobile site or something like that. One other bit just to notice here is that there's a little bit of there is one other key value pair in the end of our link, display swap. That just indicated that if the font, before the font is available, that you do actually want to use the font stack to render your text. So the alternative here is that you could not render anything until the font downloads if you would rather have a blank pause rather than a glitch while the font rendering switches from cursive to, in this case, special lead. So all of these fonts are available on developers.google.com. Fonts docs, the description of the font documentation for other tricks and tips are all here. Fonts docs CSS2. That's kind of the nuts and bolts of using the Google Font website. Using the Adobe Font site is similar. Google Fonts is really the one that's blazed the path here. So just to summarize, fonts on the web used to be very hard because of legal encumbrances. But Google and Microsoft before them have changed the way in which web standards are set for fonts. You still have to be aware that using fonts requires you to license the fonts, but almost all the fonts that are available on the Google Fonts page are free both in terms of unencumbered by license, but also free in terms of not costing anything, are available on their website. And Adobe has responded because of Google's success in offering a similar service. But you got to remember not to go crazy because fonts consume bandwidth as well. So I hope that this description of web fonts, fonts on the web, helps you to use fonts with confidence, both from a legal perspective, but also from an aesthetic perspective, so that all of the material that we see on the web can look beautiful, render quickly, and be done legally and properly. Thank you for your attention.